Greetings and salutations, comrades. Hope this finds you well. Wanted to share this article by Danny Haiphong that's posted at the Black Agenda Report. Link it down below as well in the description box. And it's having to do with the U.S. trying to institute this new Cold War against China, and that's obviously really horrible in a lot of ways. China has been able to do so many things since the socialist revolution in 1949. They were able to eradicate extreme poverty in that country. In 2020, they're developing all types of high-speed infrastructure. They have bullet trains there that go 300 miles per hour, while most of the U.S. is stuck with fucking shitty Amtrak that goes 60 miles per hour, if that. And yeah, so just thought this article is really worth pointing out, and we don't need any type of Cold War with China or any other country. That would obviously have hugely disastrous consequences. And we need to call out U.S. aggression, U.S. imperialism, the U.S. empire, because it's the biggest purveyor of death and destruction in the world right now. And China is not the enemy. China is a socialist country. They're still obviously working through their various contradictions, but that's up to them. That's up to the Chinese people for them to figure that out for themselves. Also pointing out that a huge, vast majority of people in China, this Harvard survey that came out in 2016, I believe, showed that 95% of people in China, at least that were surveyed, had a highly satisfied view of the central government in Beijing. In the United States, that number is maybe 25 to 40%, if that. So they're obviously doing something right, so share this article from Danny Haiphong at the Black Agenda Report. Definitely check out Danny Haiphong's work, support him on Patreon if you're able to. He's a really great, anti-imperialist journalist and worthy of supporting for sure. Propaganda war against China aims to expand U.S. hegemony and eradicate socialism, because again, China is a socialist country. Socialism with Chinese characteristics, which I'll be having somebody on the channel in a couple weeks to talk about that exact subject, actually, which I'm excited about. Anti-China propaganda is intended to indoctrinate Americans with fear and hatred and gain support for war against that country and against socialism itself. 100%. I mean, just look how well China has been able to handle this pandemic. Let me Google deaths in China from COVID-19. Last time I looked, it was like 5,000. Let's see. It's still 4,636 deaths. U.S. So again, less than 5,000 people have died from COVID-19 in the United States, or I should say in China. Wish in the United States, 722,000. Yesterday, October 14th, 1,600 people died, and we've had 44 million cases, while China is less than 100,000 cases and less than 5,000 people have died. And I think, again, that is one of the reasons why the U.S. has, ramped up this new Cold War against China and claims of Uyghur genocide, etc., was to take blame away from the U.S., ruling class, the ruling elite, how they've utterly failed, or I should say maybe are completely incapable of handling this pandemic because we live in this capitalist, economic system. Friends of Socialist China, which is a great org, definitely check them out, support their work as well. Formed out of what we saw as a dire need to gather all info, original and otherwise, to counter the misinformation being spread about China. We didn't include the word socialist in our title for gimmick or display, but rather to send a firm message of respect and admiration to the Chinese people's socialist path. In many ways, the propaganda war against China possesses a dual mission: the ramping up of dangerous U.S. new Cold War against China and the demonization of socialist mode of production. We at Friends of Socialist China have identified an immense gap in the political development of progressive forces in the Western world. 100%. There's a huge, blind spot particularly when it comes to China. I think progressive forces in the West reside in the most propagandized societies in the world when it comes to China. For example, majorities of people in the US saw China as a threat to their, oh my God, I mean, China exports, infrastructure and the Belt and Road Initiative, while the U.S. exports bombs, death, regime change, sanctions, etc. But 100% with these Western countries, the most propagandized in the world, especially with China. This includes many so-called progressive orgs and even those who identify as socialists. 100%. I see people, on different social media platforms who claim to be socialist, and they're talking shit about China. Like, that shit needs to stop. Thus, we see it as our duty to not only stand against the dangerous war provocations at the root of anti-China propaganda, but also to engage in the process of educating the mass of people about China and the socialist world. The debates around propaganda in the West is generally confined to an idealistic framework of make-believe abstract concepts of good and evil fit comfortably within the capitalist order that privileges the profits of wealthier, mainly white individuals at the expense of the vast collective of humanity. Good and evil can be easily manipulated and repurposed to serve powerful actors within the Western media, political, military, industrial complex. For the first decade of the 21st century, evil was defined as terrorism. Any country that was labeled a harbor of terrorism became an instant target for war and regime change. Now these same neocon actors, led by the US, tell us that China is the latest evil that the world should worry about most. Billionaire investor George Soros wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal last August, presents a good example of the 21st century version of yellow peril. Soros specifically targeted Xi Jinping, president of China, calling him the greatest threat to the giant rat. The greatest threat to the Chinese state would be the U.S. imperialism, the U.S. empire. Soros, the absolute fucking hack. The wealthy titan of investor capital claims that China under Xi has become authoritarian, warlike. Really? Again, it's another clear case of projection. The United States has 700 plus military bases in 60 or 70 countries around the world. They export, again, bombs, death, destruction, occupation, propping up these brutal dictatorships, sanctioning countries who aren't willing to fall in line. But no, China is the warlike and aggressive nation. Shut the fuck up, dude. China can do no good, and we shall all be very, very afraid. Just weeks later, Soros penned another op-ed, this time for the Financial Times, claiming that China's lack of understanding of the free market placed foreign investors at risk. Both articles, Soros dropped major hints of a strong belief that rich private capitalists speak for all of humanity, as they all do, right? He laments that Xi Jinping is seeking to destroy the geese that lays the golden egg. This is metaphoric speak for private Western investors such as himself, who see recent efforts to promote common prosperity in China as a direct threat to their dream of the socialist country becoming a Western-style democracy. They don't need that. They don't want that. They need to keep on their socialist path, because socialism is the only way to uplift the masses, while Western-style democracy would be a great way to roll back all of those massive gains that they made since the socialist revolution in 49. Soros goes on to demand that the U.S. Congress formulate legislation that prohibits asset managers from investing in Chinese companies unless they have a transparent structure amenable to foreign stakeholders. In other words, China must allow foreign corporations to dictate its economic affairs to be punished accordingly. George Soros' seemingly unhinged anti-China screeds are important because they expose the underlying basis for the propaganda war against China. Capitalist investors such as Soros has never forgiven China for waging a successful revolution and placing the sovereignty and dignity of the Chinese people above their own narrow and profit-driven interests. China's economic reforms beginning in the 1970s offered lucrative opportunities for foreign investors to benefit from the Chinese market, but this has not satisfied those in the US and West who want to own the Chinese market entirely. At the root of the propaganda war is a motivation to bring about a second century of humiliation in China, where the nation is once again subservient to the exploitative dictates of Western capitalist order. This is particularly fitting for George Soros, since it was his speculative activities at the head of the quantum hedge fund that helped facilitate the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s. The propaganda war against China intentionally ignores history and, in fact, in an effort to satisfy the narrow interests of a minority of imperialist countries, mainly the US, 100%. But history is our greatest tool for understanding the present, and history says that the US and imperialist allies in the West are guilty of the very crimes they misattribute to China, 100%. China has not committed anything that we call the genocide in Xinjiang, but the US has committed several. This includes the near extermination of indigenous nations, which served as material foundation of the development of the U.S. capitalist economy. China does not employ slave labor, but the U.S. slave labor is crucial to U.S. development, not to mention the United States has the world's largest prison population, and slavery was outlawed, but not if you're a prisoner, right? Yep, prison labor, which has been compared to slavery, remains a major component of U.S. political economy. Haiphong on point as usual. His analysis is, going in the same direction as mine. I like it. Worse than hypocritical claims of Chinese military aggression that gives the United States, given the United States spends more on its military than next 11 countries combined, and has been at war for more than 90% of its history. Yes, but China is the warlike country. They're the aggressor here. Soros and these other, imperialist hacks want you to believe. Preposterous characterizations of China's political system as a repressive dictatorship covered up the COVID-19 pandemic, minimized, yes, 100%. I was talking about this earlier, that the U.S. leads the world in COVID-19 cases and deaths. Possessive government is increasingly mistrusted by majorities of the population for good reason, right? Because they're completely bought and paid for by the capitalist class and do their bidding. And we've seen that during the pandemic. Hence, 700,000+ people fucking dead. China, less than 5,000. Huge difference. Not to mention China's population is 3-4 times bigger. And indeed, much of the world, this just scratches the surface of the intense hypocrisy that plagues the US-led propaganda war against China. US hypocrisy exposes a fatal flaw in the designs of the propaganda war. Built into this war is the fundamental quest to keep China and the rest of the world in a state of dependency on US hegemonic interess. But the US, once proclaimed the leader of the free world, is now in a state of decline. Internally, living standards for the vast majority of people are worsening, and racial cleavages exacerbating amid runaway privatization and inequality. U.S. foreign policy is increasingly defined by might makes right to compensate for the economic contraction of the U.S. capitalist system, trying to find, new markets, new lands, new people to exploit, right? Since neither the U.S. nor its allies are in a position to provide an example to the world we're following, China and any other country that seeks a certain independent path of development has been targeted for containment, a euphemism for the new Cold War. It's massively important that we call the propaganda war against China what it is, an imperialist and racist set of fabrications wielded in the interests of U.S. unipolar hegemony. More than this, the propaganda war denigrates the achievements of socialism and erases the immense sacrifices of the Chinese people. People living within an aggressor country, the imperial core right here in the United States, have been stripped of their own right to learn from China's massively successful response to COVID-19. Again, less than 5,000 people have died in China from COVID, while 100+ times more people have died in the US. Right? That's huge. That's a huge, massive accomplishment. That massive amount of life that they've saved, that they've protected, compared to this capitalist death cult here in the United States. China's defeat of extreme poverty last year raises important lessons for increasingly poverty-stricken Western societies, but these have gone unheeded in a climate of Cold War-like hostility. As disillusionment in the false promises of so-called Western democracy grows, the fact that more than, here, as I was talking about earlier, the fact that more than 95% of Chinese people trust their governance system deserves deep study rather than the skepticism offered by the US-led new Cold War. We at Friends of Socialist China reject the premise that the propaganda war can be fought solely by exposing the criminality of its architects. Friends of Socialist China is a tool for progressive forces everywhere to build mass opposition to imperialist aggression and solidarity with China's right to peaceful socialist development on terms determined by the Chinese people. The reality is that the former cannot exist without the latter. Luckily, the achievements of the Chinese Revolution and the World Socialist Movement can teach us this important lesson, so as long as they are defended from the slander of imperialism. Boom. Well said. Definitely check out Danny Haiphong's work at the Black Agenda Report. Support his work, become a Patreon. If you're able to, definitely check out him and Margaret Kimberly's work at the Left Lens YouTube channel. as well. Follow him on Twitter at Spirit of Ho. Again, his work, his analysis, always on point from what I've seen. Definitely worth supporting and worth calling out. The U.S.'s new Cold War on China. We need to, be friends of socialist China, as that organization he was a part of in creating. Super important, right? Let's see, did I do the shout out? Yeah, I'm not sure. Shout out to the 2 Uber comrades supporting my channel on Patreon, my partner and Independent News. Like the video if you like the damn video, subscribe for more content, all part of the people.